Jesus calmed the wind and the sea, and the disciples responded with an age-old question. Who is this? The specific way it was worded today was, who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? But that's just one iteration of this question that has permeated various contexts over the years. Who is this that blank? Who is this that the wind and the sea obey him? Who is this that multiplies loaves and fishes? Who is this that died and yet isn't even contained by death? In so many words, the response is, this is God, and the fact we had to ask that question just might mean that God is bigger than we thought. From the viewpoint of a disciple on that day, something strange was afloat. God in Christ was doing things that eclipsed people's expectations. Hence, they asked, who is this that can do that? And before we get too comfortable reading about the disciples' shock from a safe distance away as just words on a page, let's remember that this question can get asked and permeate faith journeys today as well. There's a story about this gospel tale, I've mentioned this in other contexts before, about a California pastor who was approached one day by a group of Laotian refugees. In their own words, they didn't know much about Jesus, but they wanted to join the church. The pastor, happy to welcome them, offered to lead them through a gospel study on the Gospel of Mark to help them learn a little more about Jesus and the nature of this community they wanted to be a part of. Come one class day, they made it to this exact story. And after it was read, the pastor asked the crowd, or asked the group, to think about the storms in their life that Jesus can calm. You know, any worries, any problems or struggles. And he is met by a long, awkward silence. Eventually, some person in the group speaks up and says, "Do you mean that Jesus actually calmed the wind and the sea?" The pastor's response was, "Well, yes, but we should not get hung up on the details of the miracle. We should remember that Jesus can calm the storms in our lives." And after another long, awkward silence, somebody else speaks up and says, "Well, if Jesus calmed the wind and the waves, he must be very powerful." And all of a sudden, the group has become ablaze with excitement. They are chatting with one another. The group dynamic has become something like worship. They are sold. They want to see where this journey takes them. Meanwhile, that pastor found himself on the outside, looking in. Upon reflection of that moment, he later wrote that he had so taken Jesus for granted, he had missed him altogether. In that Bible study, those brand new disciples essentially asked, "Who is this?" And they asked it with excitement and eagerness. Meanwhile, the pastor had to ask himself, "Who is this?" Because he missed the who altogether, despite staring right at him. Among other things, this story is a call to recognize God as God. And that can be as tricky as it sounds simple, because the God we often internalize or like to believe in is too small. Maybe this comes about from trying to rationalize what has happened in our lives, but doing so in ways that reduce God to a neatly packaged, palatable concept, being unaware of what we have left on the cutting room floor of that process. Or maybe we ponder scripture stories and we have the best intentions, like that pastor did, but now and again we replace God with a pale substitute as we ponder these stories. Consequently, once God does show up, we're surprised to find that, in the words of Archbishop Rowan Williams, God just might be gaudy. Thus framing us a little bit like those disciples, saying, "Who is this?" Because ultimately, whatever we put in the blank of that question represents the point where our idea of God shrunk a little bit. Who is this that the wind and the sea obey him? Well, it's God. And the disciples on that day got a in-your-face reminder that the wind and the sea are not beyond God's reach. Who is this that can actively speak to people today and utter words of prophecy in 2021? Well, God can do that. God does that, even if we don't always remember. Who is this that can forgive sins? Yes, even that one, the one we're thinking about right now. Maybe it's one you've done that you thought rendered yourself incapable of holiness. Or maybe it's one that someone else did that you thought meant you needed to excommunicate them from their life. Who is this who can forgive that? God. God can do that. Now, asking this question is not innately a problem. In fact, it is often quite a good thing to learn more about God, right? All members of that Bible study in California benefited from asking that question. Back in March of 2020, words like COVID and social distancing became increasingly popular to use. And in the time that followed, we asked, who is this who can be with us even when we're physically apart? And wouldn't you know it, the answer is God can do that. God is doing that. So asking this question is a lovely, healthy thing. But maybe sometimes we forget to ask it in the first place. We're coming on the end of my 2-year curacy here. We knew this was coming. That's the nature of these commitments. Lots of blessings and memories, lots of ways we could turn this from a sermon into a highlight reel or something that sounds like an obituary if the preacher is not careful. Here's one memory that might or might not be on the surface of our minds. A lot has happened since then. But back in February of 2020, or as some folks like to say, the before times, there was a Sunday where the gospel reading up to bat was a portion of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. We're in Matthew chapter 5 here. And of that fairly sizable portion we read, there were 2 verses in which Jesus talked about divorce. Here's how it goes. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of unchastity causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. In the Episcopal world all over, there were some immediate ways that people reacted to that text. Some folks preemptively assumed that no good news could come from that gospel reading. Maybe they were very justified in it. There are lots of marriages that have left scars. There are ways that a person can understandably feel that way. There were others that treated it as if we had found scriptural kryptonite, which we must preemptively apologize for, or try to focus on something else and hope nobody heard that too carefully. That's how a lot of folks have viewed that whenever it comes up on a Sunday or a Bible study or any sort of presentation. For at least a couple of services here that day, we did something crazy, y'all. At the encouragement of several mentors, several of whom are divorced, we decided to try and have an open mind, to just explore it, see what can come from it. And in doing so, we learned a few things. In so many words, we learned that in first century Judea, some people, mainly at the top tier of society, were way too flippant about marriage. They treated divorce as a quick and easy way to marry up to a more prestigious spouse, treating it almost like a car you can trade in or a TV whenever you get bored of it. Does that sound like love to you? Jesus spoke those words in those times to a society that needed to take relationships more seriously again by seeing human beings as human beings, much like how Jesus humanized himself for us and now sticks with us to have and to hold us in sickness and in health, for richer, for poorer. On another level of society at that time, middle and lower class, divorce was taken a little more seriously, but to an extreme, viewed as some untouchable curse, relegating one, if not both members of that former relationship to a lifetime of shame, financial poverty, and marginalization. Does that sound like love either? In response to that, we looked at those words from Matthew and we realized that there are some things that Jesus didn't say there. Jesus did not say, "Whoever gets divorced has committed adultery and therefore is beyond my help." Nor did he say, "and therefore must be avoided," and therefore, no, nothing of the sorts, though we might have subconsciously thought Jesus was saying that. We found some breathing room in there, y'all. We found some love undergirding those scriptures. And several folks graciously shared that they had never heard that before. They had never heard the church talk about it before. Which means on that day, we as a community did a very brave thing. We started to ask, who is this? Who is this that can display love even when discussing that topic? Good news can show up in the midst of this? How's that possible? The answer is it's God. And no, this isn't outside of God's reach. God is God after all. By the way, Marina, if you're watching, hi, love you, dear. So glad we're married still. God is abundantly present even when we think things are getting dicey. If we forget to ask, who is this in those moments, we subconsciously forget that God can be present there. Almost as if we say, no, God, don't worry about me. You wouldn't understand this. Why don't you wait outside for me? I'll try and get back in a moment, okay? In reality, God is often present right in those heavy moments. There's no aspect of human experience beyond the scope of God's reach. So the question is not, can I handle this, or can I understand this, or can my friends relate to this with their experience? The main question is, can God handle this? And that opens up a lot of things. That's grace for you. We've got several official services in the Episcopal Church. They aren't used on a weekly basis. They are written with a more pointed, specific life moment in mind. I loosely categorize them as the atypical liturgies. One such one in the Book of Occasional Services is called a service of renaming. It uses they and them pronouns. It's written for a person who might have undergone a gender transition or any reason to change their name, really. It gives them a chance to mark this in the church, for the church to support it. The prayers therein mention the name changes of Abraham, Sarah, and Jacob. It gives the congregation a chance to lay hands on them when pandemic parameters permit, and to bless them, knowing that God has made an everlasting covenant with them. For that person, they quite possibly had to go through a period of inner turmoil, discernment, maybe some disagreements or fights with friends and loved ones. That's far too easy to describe using storm imagery. So in so many words, what we hope that service does is get the person to experience God and to think, oh, who is this? Who is this who cares for me and works on me during this transition and is going to keep doing so, not despite it, but precisely through it? It's God. Going over to things with a negative ending, there's another atypical service called a form of prayer when life-sustaining treatment is withheld or discontinued. Self-explanatory title, and through the prayers in that liturgy, we offer thanks for the love and companionship of the person in question. We ask God to give us grace to accept the limits of human healing as we commend that person to God's merciful care. The service is for a person near the end of life's journey, and certainly for the friends and caregivers who might be swimming in heavy grief and sadness. I'm not looking forward to using that someday, but should the day come, I really hope that people in the midst of that rite can experience God and to think, who is this? Who is this who's with me here? It's God. Who is this? Who's this who's on the cross? Wait, he's doing what? Oh. Who is this in the prayers and fellowship, in the breaking of bread? Oh, he's doing what through that? Oh. Can we remember to ask, who is this through the thick and the thin moving forward? I better hear that y'all keep asking that question long after you last see me. Amen.